Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. If God is in all places at all times, why do most people not experience it? Well, Edenity has 13 reasons for you to consider. That's our discussion today on the not-so-hidden God. We'll begin with the reason why we've related to God as a to believe or not believe issue since the dawn of civilization, and explore some of our very real reasons why your protection mechanisms have a vested interest in not experiencing God directly. There is no escaping self-interest after all. Thanks so much for listening. Greetings and welcome forward, everybody. Hello, Stace. Thank you for being here as usual. Well, this is a rare circumstance where we have a pre-title. Normally I create the titles after the fact, but the title of today's program, or at least the tentative title, is The Not-So-Hidden God. Where should we begin?
Well, I guess let's start in a meta space and we'll kind of funnel down. In one specific domain of spiritual concern. Really, one way to describe our species, a way of how it's framed human life on Earth, is that there are two main possibilities that frame how we experience ourselves as humans. One is there is no God, and that means Mother Nature is our parent, right? And that makes our humanness no different than any other animal on the planet. Or there is a God or spirit dimension of being within which our human beings and everything else condenses or precipitates, right? And in that second possibility, of course, then there's room for wondering, how can I say it? What makes us different than animals, and also involves the whole question of a soul that maybe survives physical death and so may be reincarnatable. Mm-hmm. So these are bifurcating streams of inquiry and assumptions that have governed the difference between a secular empirical world and a spiritual, religio-spiritual world. So our species have bickered around this issue for centuries and centuries and centuries, of course, and that involves all these. These are antithetical philosophies of human context, and so both sides are represented by a bunch of different philosophies and value systems. But to address that. But Edenity offers a very different value system and philosophy about how to address the issue of is there a God or is there not a God? Because Edenity offers a Dharma, which we'll talk a bit more about, in how to actually personally experience divine being and no longer need belief, like we've talked about so many times.
Yeah, the frame of believe or not believe, that has been the very bad question, or a dead-endable question. How about that as a frame? It's a dead-endable question.
Exactly. That bifurcation of the two worldviews of what contexts or not, or Mother Nature or a divine being of some sort.
I want to insert an observation. I just had this recently talking with a client about the client said, the question I asked was, did you feel that your parents loved you? Mm-hmm. I think it was specifically about her father. Did you feel that he loved you? Mm-hmm. And the client said, deep down, I knew he did. Uh-huh. And I went, hold on a second. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really answer the question. And we sort of unpacked and went deeper into that. And that was the same experience that I had in my family. So it was very resonative and this is very common for fathers, I think, with children and their fathers. It's like, well, he never says, I love you. Mom says, I love you. Yeah. Whether you actually feel it is a whole other question. But Dad, he doesn't necessarily say, I love you, but you just know that he loves you. And in my family, there would be this part, there was sort of this part of the mythos of it, or the ethos or whatever, was like, we would say, well, dad loves you. He wouldn't say that, but my mother would say that because it was appreciated that he wasn't saying it. So you were supposed to know it. And then I'd never made this connection before of how that very same dynamic gets projected onto God.
Yes.
That it's because as children, we don't, to a significant degree, depending on the circumstance, we significantly don't experience love from our parents, but we know we're supposed to.
Yes.
And they tell us, but we don't feel it. And then we project that exact circumstance onto God. Well, I don't actually experience it, but I love the idea of it. So I'll just believe it. And then I kind of experience it. Maybe that's what love is.
Oh, you described the problem so tragically beautifully.
Yeah.
I'm smiling, but it's
awful.
It's an awful thing. And it's no coincidence, that we project onto our ultimate parent our experience with our incarnational parents in any way.
And that's crazy to me that situation then, like that exact situation, became the philosophical and religious frame of God for like all of human civilization. Should I believe in it or not? And it's like all because people don't experience the love of their parents sufficiently. That's so crazy.
Great observation. I never had put it together in that direct sequence of linearity. You connected the dots there really beautifully.
I'd never thought about it either before. It was like, no wonder. So in other words, because it's when you actually communicate to someone, like, hey, it's not about believing or disbelieving, but actually experiencing, and you point to Muhammad or Moses or Yeshua, and like that they directly talked about their direct experiences of God, and they didn't actually talk about believing it except in mistranslations here and there. People are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Well, if it makes such obvious intuitive sense, why have we been so deluded for thousands of years? Because of that emotional distortion.
It's right up it's the middle of the bowling lane here for me on this, what you're saying there, because it's I've always exhorted people over the years to consider how the promise of religion is never been fulfilled, to put you in contact with God. Yeah. The best thing it can do is put you in contact with a belief in God.
Yeah.
And that's not unreal, but it's like building a bridge across a chasm, and then you can see the chasm, but you can't walk across the bridge to the other side.
Yeah, and that's why at 7 years old, when I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they said you can talk to God with this Ark thing, I was like, yeah, I want that. But all of the Jewish conditioning I got in Hebrew school, which was all about belief, didn't appeal to me in the least. I want to talk to God. At 7 years old, I wanted to talk to God. And they didn't even promise that, especially in the Reformed Judaism that I was brought up in. It's not even about believing in it per se. It's more about the tradition, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Did you have female rabbis in your Reformed version?
Yeah. There was only one rabbi because it was such a small town. I think it would have been, I think it would have been accepted, but there wasn't actually one, but yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that something? The religions, because it was a pre-psychological age, and they had no idea about the unconscious in that time. So that's why they devolved to original sin or whatever it is the bugaboo, Satan. It's so amazing that they set the bar so low to belief as opposed to experience. If we had the Pope on the podcast here, I'd ask him, does the Catholic Church claim to be able to put people into contact with God, or is belief enough for all of you and the way you view things? I'd love to ask him that question.
Well, and there's the hierarchy of the church, right? Because in pre-Renaissance, or I guess even Renaissance Catholicism, it was definitely not about the common man experiencing God. That's what the clergy was for. And we'll let you know what he says. and to the point where it's not the Bible's not even translated into your language. We'll read it and then tell
Right.
you. So
In
that
fact,
division was hardscaped.
oh, nicely put. And another a proof of that, or another expression of that, was that if you dared in early Christianity to try to be like Jesus, they would call you a heretic.
Yeah, but that's what's going to be crazy about Jesus. Like, you're supposed to be like Jesus, but he's
Right.
the Son of God, so you couldn't ever possibly be like that. Well, which the hell is it?
Right, exactly. In fact, you risked if you tried to forgive, quote unquote, one silly example, if you forgive like Jesus forgave, uh, you would be laughed or stoned in one way because you're elevating yourself to the level of Jesus's
Yeah.
consciousness. See,
Isn't that apotheosis? Is that what that word is?
exactly
Yeah.
right.
And so Jesus was worthy of God's love.
Yes.
And you should be like him, but you're not worthy of God's love. Well, that's kind of a big barrier to being like Jesus, right? Like, I can't be sinned and worthy of God. Oh my God. It's crazy.
No, it's taken 40 years for me to laugh about this because I've had such horrific experiences of pain and hopelessness about how low the bar is the religion set for actually encountering divinity. That's what
And I
today.
wanted to say something. I wonder, like, I often feel self-conscious about laughing at the preposterousness of the metaphysics. But when I encounter this with people and talking with it, it's not laughable at all, because you're feeling the twistedness in the person's emotional body that it does. It's absolutely awful
Yeah, yeah,
and laughable at the level of metaphysics and logic.
sure. And so, yeah, I've had such mixed feelings about it over the years, but most of my reactivity was determined by I'd always have people write out what it is that how they experience Catholicism, because I wanted the personal story of how people suffered under it. And that always uncovered personal stuff also. And so the literally, I don't know, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 dozen examples I've had of that over the 70 years I've been working in this paradigm, their testimony about how badly they endured abuse or neglect by the Catholic Church made them sour on God altogether.
Yeah.
And that's the second tragedy, is that these religions get it so mixed up upside down and inside out that a rational, sane person might go to the other side. And in that way, I always argue that religions are technically so indefensible that they actually produce the opposite effect and drive a good percentage of people into atheism.
Yeah, that, or just like Meister Eckhart said, that the belief in God prevents you from the experience of it. So either it locks you into a mental body picture, which won't ever bring it to you, or it drives you to push away from the idea because it's only an idea entirely, rather than a process of healing to encounter.
Exactly right. So in that sense, we'll repeat this in a few minutes, I think, but the first parameter or proposal that Edenity brings about why people don't experience divine being directly is because of belief. That's the basic starting point. Belief will prevent, because belief is a position. You can have a sense. Many people have a sense of divinity, and then they link that to the belief and think that, like we've said before, that belief is a heart-centered thing, but it's not. It's an energetic orientation or position you take based on a sense. Not many people, not all people have a sense of the divine, and yet that all they're left with then is this positionality about a belief.
And this is also predicated on the fact, we would argue, that people process reality vastly through the mental body without even realizing that they're doing that.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the counterintuitive metaphysics of that very thing here as we talk here today. So in that sense, we've as we said in other podcasts, belief itself only exists in a context of never having actually experienced that which we have a belief about, right? We don't need to believe in the sun because we can directly experience it. Just so, a belief in God is only required when we haven't yet experienced it. There's 13. I come up with 13 parameters or proposals that will explain why we don't experience divine being. The
13. Wow. Cool.
13 of them. It's just they recently fell out of me, and so the first one is about belief, just as we've been saying. The second parameter, and again, I love your rabbit holes, and you just stop me at any moment.
Okay.
The second of 13 is that despite how most of us have never had a direct experience of it, if there is a God, we're starting from scratch here to try to build the argument on how to experience it and have it proven to yourself. If there is a God, there could never be any structural separation from it between us and it. No structural, because if there were, that would mean there was something outside. If we weren't inside of God at all times, then we would be outside, and nothing can be outside of God, or God can't be God.
Oh, so number two is that we're looking for something outside of us.
Exactly right. And we'll get to how complex actually that question becomes with hierarchy versus holoarchy. But in this sense, the supposition proposal here is that we cannot ever be separated from divine being, or else it wouldn't be divine being. Everything that is must be somehow embedded within this God that supposedly is, with no structural boundaries, only artificially conditioned experiential boundaries. And that's the third parameter.
Like original sin, that kind of?
Yeah, let's go from the meta first, though. You're exactly right. Any personal sense of any separation from God, then, could only be subjectively experiential, not structurally. You see? Because if there's no separation structurally, any sense that we have that we're separated from God must be a subjectively experiential dynamic and not any objective structural truth, based in how anything that's merely subjectively experiential, I can be technical here, is actually an artificial conditioning. Mm-hmm. Anything that is subjectively experiential makes room for being conditioned in 1,000 different ways.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's a really important link here, that any sense of separation from God has to be conditioned into us somehow, because structurally there is no separation. This is a really counterintuitive kind of important point, to see that only our conditioning keeps us from experiencing at this level of the parameters. It is obstructed to the experience of actually experiencing that structural embedment of a divine being. So, in that sense, if it's been conditioned into us, it can be conditioned out of us. So, in that sense, any form of conditioning can be, if you have the right dharma and exploratory abilities, any conditioning can be deconstructed, decoded, and deconditioned. It's something that was just basically merely learned, and not something essential about us. And the fact that, as we've said in actually recent podcasts, how ignorant the world is of the effect of conditioning.
Yeah.
Jiddu Krishnamurti.
The idea is just a couple hundred years old.
Absolutely. And Jiddu Krishnamurti, even though I like the other Krishnamurti, much more a clean version of enlightenment. What was his name? I always forget his first name.
J. Krishnamurti and U. Krishnamurti.
Right.
UG.
UG Krishnamurti. In that sense, anything, his main question that drove all of his teaching is, what is an unconditioned consciousness?
That was J or UG?
J. That
J,
was
yeah.
J. Yeah, that was his guiding northern star. He lived a life. That's one thing I loved about him. It was always an inquiry.
Mm.
There wasn't ever an end conclusion. It was always in process, and that was much more in alignment.
That's true Zen, yeah.
Yeah, that's true Zen. That's more in alignment of Gautama's original teaching before it got non-dualized by going to Japan and China.
Nounified, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nounified, exactly. So anything, let's quickly get back on our central track here.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. There's no structural space between separation from us from divine being, or it couldn't be divine being. The second is that if you do have a sense of a separation, then that's been conditioned into you because structurally there isn't. And third is that if something is conditioned into us, we can certainly, if you have the right parameters in your Dharma, deconstruct and decondition from that sense of separation from divine being, right? So, as you said a few minutes ago, especially in the modern day, basically all the other paradigms of the human condition will tell us that mind, will, or the physical body as brain is malconditioned into us as the essential origin of human consciousness. Mm-hmm. In other words, I am, and I have an I because I have a mind, I have will, or I have a brain. That's the malconditioning as the origin of the I, or of our ability to have relationship with experience.
Yeah, that's a structural inside versus outside-ism right there, right?
Exactly right. So only in that sense, while the mind, the will, or the brain remains malconditioned into us as the essential origin of our usness, God may be debated as an idea, but is inexperienceable as a reality.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Because the origin of the I, or the origin of being able to even communicate as a human being, is all of our paradigms of mind, will, or brain does it.
And I just want to add in here, the proof of this has been shown in the casual clinical trials of emotional body and soulment over the last, 40 years now?
40 years, yes.
40 years. And I myself was one of those guinea pigs. When I began the process, I was a incurious agnostic, I would say. I was not, I didn't know, and I wasn't doing much to find out about the divine. And the deconditioning from my childhood, without any intention whatsoever, led me straight into experiences of the divine without any belief whatsoever.
That's such an important point, Joseph, that even the most dense version of Edenity's Dharma is personhood, where we get into content. It has its own meta, of course, in context, but it's the densest Dharma in that sense, with no, and that's the key that you just said, with no aim to reveal the divine, just by deconditioning your personal experience.
Not only no aim, no real interest, and actually plenty of resistance and judgment about it. So I often say, like, back then you had the sainthood and sagehood as quite separate from personhood, and you were presenting personhood as like its own thing, and maybe one day you'll look at these other hoods. You didn't present it as one whole picture. And it's a good thing for me that you didn't, because I probably would have been really turned off by it. And so, like, not only was I not looking for any experience of the divine, but the process of emotional body and soulment has brought up plenty of quite challenging stuff related to that, because it is inextricably intertwined with the nature of my very soul. And my protection mechanisms were quite committed to that staying separate from me. And that's still something I wrestle with. So there's the proof in the pudding, is your relationship with God might be intentionally separated from you, and it might come upon you without you even wanting to look at it, and that's a whole separate kind of journey.
Yeah, and the data that I always got, Joseph, by people like yourself who had no interest and even some resistance, who got into it as a sort of psychology on steroids
Yeah.
dynamic, when it did unfold, that without trying and in the presence of some resistance, some revealment of divinity became palpable and experiential. That told me, that was data that told me that there was something, because not everyone has that.
Yep.
Those that does show up with already, I could characterize it in a couple of ways. My first reactions to it was, well, only an elder soul would have that revealable, the divine revealable by simply unwinding and deconditioning from local incarnational parental or childhood wounding, because it must be, my first assumption and feeling was it was loaded back there and came out simply by unscrewing some tightness in the personal domain, and
Yeah.
bam, there it was. See, so that was my first way of parameterizing older or elder souls when that popped out without any intention.
Yeah, and to me, that remains to be one of the most compelling examples of how how EBE is not just really good therapy. It's actually working at the level of soul because of those kinds of emergent phenomena that things
Yep.
happen, aspects of attributes, qualities, attainments come through that for no good reason,
Yes.
for no obvious reason, they just show up.
With no obvious, yeah.
And yeah, sometimes there are ways in which you become someone that you had no intention or desire to become, but it's always good because it's you.
Exactly. So let's recoup for number 5 and go to number 6 here. Again, when mind, will, or the body remains the origination story of our being, basically, meaning it's when the mind dies, the will dies, the physical body dies. That's the end of the story. God can be debated, but those assumptions will absolutely prevent an actual experience of the not so hidden God. So we already described how all forms only conditioning will give us a sense of separation from divinity because there's no structural. So now we go to the next step, number 6. Identity offers that all forms of conditioning, all forms to some degree, is largely based, and this is a seminal assumption, all conditioning, and this is something no Eastern teaching has, that all of our conditioning is largely based in some degree with emotive wounding only. It's not just that we're taught the earth is flat, for example. Certainly there are those layers that do that, but those can be affirmed or denied by more secular factual experimentation and observation. What I'm saying is the root of all conditioning, the conditioning itself wouldn't stick unless there was emotional wounding at the bottom of it. So if someone comes to me and says, "Well, I believe that the world is flat," I would say, "Well, go to Portugal on the sea there and watch a boat come in. You'll see the mast first on the horizon before you ever see the hull come up. And there's the curvature and a very simple opportunity right there. But if if such a person still insists, I'm not interested in any proofs because this is what I believe, I would then assume that he's got a really gnarly kind of emotional wound against some authority that told this person something that turned out to be really false, and so doesn't trust any authority whatsoever. There's an emotional wound right there at the basis of a obstinate kind of conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a game changer. That's a sea change to actually look at all forms of conditioning not as something to transcend in the Eastern way, because they're very clear about what conditioning is. The West isn't. In that sense,
but it can't be transcended because it's in the emotional body. It's not just sitting in the mind.
That's our position.
That's Edenity's position.
Yeah, to test. So this means that conditioning is not just ideationally or willfully held positions or orientations. It means all manner of conditioning can be healed away, not transcended away, healed away with an appropriately focused Dharma. That's number 6. But now that leads us right directly into such a healing or appropriately focused Dharma can only occur when in a process whose algorithm of change or healing is based in how emotivity is upstream, is the primary aspect of human consciousness, upstream of mentality, willfulness, or physicality, as is currently held in virtually all of our paradigms of human consciousness.
And it's related to that God is love, love is emotion. If you're not relating to yourself as emotive at core, you're going to automatically, structurally be separated from the divine.
Wow, you go right to the end really fast. We're still painstakingly unfolding the inevitable sequence.
Okay, sorry about that.
Of course, no, you're exactly right. So if we say that the position or parameter of Edenity is that the healing of conditioning can only occur within a paradigm, and Edenity is that paradigm, where emotivity is held as the primary aspect of human consciousness, that we feel things before we cognate them, before we abstract them, and before we act on them. And there are physiologists and psychologists who do research in this, and way later than I learned, actually verify that with testing in a laboratory, that human beings feel something. They can track amygdalic sources in the brain are activated before the cognitive are activated. And so,
and this is how marketing and advertising works. It's like, I remember when I studied business, when I learning this, it's very clear human beings make purchase decisions unconsciously and emotionally first, and then justify them rationally. And then, there's so much money has been put into that, it's not even a question anymore. And then I learned a bit of Edenity. Then it was like, wait, why would purchasing decisions be different than any other decision?
Right.
But wait, so when you choose to marry someone, that's somehow really rational, different than when you choose that lawnmower to buy. And
right. Yeah, actually, it's a beautiful spotlight on the very issue we're talking about. That people don't act in rational self-interest at all. They don't make purchases in rational self-interest.
Yeah, and this is why Freud's work radically changed the world of political propaganda that Hitler jumped on, and then marketing. Right. It was all. It's far more used to condition people and to influence their purchasing decisions than it is to heal them. That principle.
Yes, absolutely.
Unfortunately, there's the will versus love-based world that we live in.
Exactly right. Okay, so that was number 7 in our sequence of 13, that emotivity is the primary, the offering here, primary aspect of human consciousness, not mentality, physicality, or willfulness. Now we take a little jump, a little lateral to the stream, but it still connects, the dots are still connectable. Now the next one in the sequence, here's the proposal by Edenity, that the dualistic mind itself prevents a direct experience of God as an inappropriate tool to do so, in the same way as we said so many times, a fishnet can't hold water or a microscope can't study the stars, right?
God is not dualistic.
So, say again?
Because God is not dualistic.
Exactly right, and we'll get to that here in a minute.
Oh, okay.
No, that's fine. I mean, you're anticipating all this because you know this so well. I just wanted to create this unfolding. What's the word? Begins with an E. Exhaustive kind of unfolding as an argument, almost a
treatise.
A treatise. Yes. Mm-hmm. So now that's the next assumption that can be the dualistic mind prevents a direct experience of God, but we do have questions, and here's a ripe one for you to expound on too, Joseph, is that I had once someone in a different context in a seminar a long time ago ask me about this and said, well, you say you've had a non-dual enlightenment experience. Yeah. And every other enlightened experience, guru that I know doesn't experience any sort of God. And because even after their dualistic mind is wiped tabula rasa. So he said, why don't enlightened masters directly experience a divine being if it's the dualistic mind itself and our attachment to it that prevents the experience of God? Why don't all of them do?
Good question. Mm-hmm.
And I love that question. And my immediate answer was because those folks are in early incarnations of having the non-dual tabula rasa of the mind experience. And there's steps according to that. In the same way as really honest and heartful, enlightened people like Ajya, for example.
Yeah, I was just going to say, he talks about God.
Yeah.
Yogananda talked about God.
Well, let's go make a little piece before that that leads right to that, is that they will tell you, honestly, that enlightenment evolves in their lifetime.
Yeah.
It's not one thing and then stays the same their whole life.
It's not a state.
It evolves. It's a state. It's always staged, not a state, right? There are stages to it. Well, at least Wilbur got that right. The difference between a stage and a stage and a state. Mm-hmm. But in that sense, if it evolves in one life, then that's just a fractal of how enlightenment, what it imparts to the being, evolves over lifetimes, right? And so my answer to this person's beautiful question was that those are souls just encountering the first dozen or so experiences with the not experience, with the non-dual. Yeah. And so that's why they don't experience a divine being. And that's why I can say, as number 8 here, is that the dualistic mind and an early non-dualistic not mind will not experience a God if it's either early in their incarnation chapters with it, or you're just not enlightened yet.
Well, and also from some of the previous pieces you talked about, conditioning, it's a myth that enlightenment erases emotional body level conditioning. It doesn't, as evidenced by people like Adi Da, who were plenty awake and were still acting like teenagers in some ways, or John de Ruyter, or any of these people who were very attained but still had observable emotional dystrophy.
Yeah, I love the way you say that. We wouldn't have all the mischief and greed and sexual impropriety among enlightened gurus if emotional body dystrophy was erased in enlightenment.
Yeah, if emotions were really a subset of mind,
it should be, right?
It would all wash it right out, yeah.
Exactly. So there's another circumstantial, not definitive, but a circumstantial support for Edenity's position that emotions are a different order of consciousness than the mind, than dualism. Mm-hmm. Emotions are much more like verbs than the nouns of thoughts and images and projections. So if emotional dystrophy can survive in real non-dual enlightenment, like Adi Da, it was the real McCoy, yet the guy, I mean, come on. And so to have Osho, who was
another good example,
enlightened, in his last worst moment, he was hiding under the seat of his private airplane as the immigration officials were coming to arrest him.
And when he was in jail, he demanded a vegetarian diet and a throne to sit on. So, the vegetarian diet, okay, but the throne to sit on while in jail, if there isn't an example of emotional dystrophy surviving enlightenment, I think that's it right there.
Yeah,
dude, your kingdom has fallen. You don't get to sit on a throne anymore.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because one person who now believes that anything that I taught in the past is rubbish. This person confronted me and said, "I never heard that he ordered a throne in jail. You're lying. You're just trying to discredit him." A former Oshoite, right? And I read this
it's news.
It was in the news, in the Portland newspaper, when they were up in Oregon doing their thing at what was the name of the town? Yeah,
I forget.
So that person never heard that, and they tried to research and said they could find no newspaper articles that ever said that. And I know what I read, so I'm glad you mentioned it. That someone else knows about this too. That it was sort of common. I was out there into the world. So there, a golden throne or some sort of a chair of authority he wanted for his cell. Let's just say it that way. So there would be no abuse, and of course, the sexual impropriety is a whole authority to what's the word the authority to the
subordinate.
Say again. Subordinate. Thank you. When an authority crosses sexual boundaries with a subordinate. It is just as dishonorable and immoral as it is in business. So where there's an authority gradient, there is no way that it isn't taking advantage of that authority gradient to get your will to have sex with your followers. And of course, this one really gets enlightened followers of enlightened gurus really gets their dandruff up, because they say, well, they're beyond the silly morals of our ridiculous cultures that come up with this idea. And my only response to them is, well, stick with that orientation until it dead ends for you. You never argue with anyone who has no curiosity about their position. It really is useless. So in that sense, let's recoup again. The dualistic mind prevents a direct experience of God as an inappropriate tool to do so, in the same way fishnet can't hold water and microscope can't study the heavens. In that way, now we come to some really juicy parts of it. Number 9 of our unfoldment is that in that way, the dualistic mind projects dualistically configured structures of hierarchy onto divinity that is actually a holoarchy, not a hierarchy.
Nice.
Okay, and that's the segue here that really starts to bring stuff home. And we said this before, but bears repeating.
And not just onto God; it does that on all sorts of things.
All sorts of things that is inappropriate to emotions, for example. And another way to say this here is that in a holoarchical being, we'd like to always define this. Divine being can be experienced as a holoarchy, and the simplest way to explain it, even though it's impossible for the mind to visualize, is that in a holoarchy, that which something is inside of is also simultaneously inside of it. In other words, you could say a personal holon, small h, exists inside of a WH holon. At the same time, the WH holon lives inside the small h holon, which is impossible in a hierarchy. For example, one floor inside of a whole building, there's a hierarchy, a meta hierarchy, you could say. One floor is inside of a whole building, but the whole building can't be inside of one floor. Or that there's one tile lies within a mosaic, but the whole mosaic cannot lie within one tile. So as soon as you begin to project hierarchy onto divine being, this is another thing that prevents the hiddenness of divine being. You cannot capture a holoarchical being when you relate to it out of a dualistically projected mind of hierarchy onto it. That it's there in heaven, and that's a different domain than earth, and that's a different domain than a purgatory in Catholicism, or a different domain as hell.
This is another expression of it being separate from us.
Exactly right. Exactly. It is impossible in a holoarchical being to be separatable from anything that is its child. So in that sense, divine being lives inside of us at the same time we live inside of it. and not and number 10 goes right from here and says no, and this is demonstrable easily, no ancient or modern religious tradition or spiritual teaching, east or west, has ever been based on the reality of a holoarchal divinity. In that sense, all those religious traditions and spiritual teachings of the present or the past, since they're not based on a holoarchal divinity, are going to in some way obstruct experience of the actual divinity.
That's because how the mind uses that paradigm. It's sort of like the next lens it looks through, right? It's looking for dualism, and then it looks through the paradigm that supports the hierarchical. Yeah, exactly.
So now we do a little sidebar that's directly related to the whole sequence. Abiding only in a belief of God, there's always this question, why doesn't it reveal itself to us?
Let us project our own limitations, delusions, and inadequacies and blame God for not revealing itself to us.
Oh my God. Yeah. And so you see where we're going here.
Why won't the water reveal itself to us, said the fish.
Yes, exactly.
What have I done wrong that I cannot encounter the water? I've heard about.
Oh God, I need to go to a fish a temple to teach me.
Yes, that's where the water is, in the fish temple. It's not anywhere else. You got to pay to get in too.
Exactly. You got to pay to get in. At this point of the inquiry, all the juiciness usually goes to why does God allow evil in the world? But that's easily answered. It doesn't. It's we who allow it, right? That's an easy one. Mm. But actually the thornier one is, why doesn't it reveal itself to us? Well, if we follow the sequence we've been on, Edenity offers that divine being is so busy revealing itself holoarchally to us, right? Mm-hmm. Our hierarchical-based physical sensibilities can't experience it. In other words,
wow.
It's so present, it looks absent to our blunt and unevolved, malconditioned ways of dualistically experiencing experience. So it's so present because it's inside us and we're inside of it holoarchally. If we use our blunt and evolved ways of dualistically experiencing some aspects of it, it's so present it will look absent to us. And this is a really important point. I just want to make a few more noises from the wet hole in my face about is this is so important. It's so innate that it looks absent, but only to when a mind or a dualistic hierarchical projection is active on it. If you start to deconstruct your emotional wounding, you will find that it's at the root of all of your unevolved ideas, unevolved expressions, and unevolved outcomes and results in your life.
I heard Adyashanti once talk about, it was, I mean, as we've talked about, he's sort of halfway between sagehood and sainthood in some ways. I don't know if he would admit that, but that seemed what it seems. And I remember once talking about seeking, he's like, you're looking for a needle in the haystack. It's the haystack. That sort of relates here. The dualistic mind is looking for something that will fit inside the dualistic mind. And sometimes all you have to do is just stop. And this is why in the old Zen stories, people, the person would get hit with a stick and suddenly they would, awaken to, they just have to get distracted out of that hierarchical way of perceiving things. And
exactly.
Or the famous tea pouring story of like, empty your cup, that thing.
So,
that's a good one. I'm still chewing on that. And because it's
so present, it looks absent.
Yeah. And it just, because in my own experience, I'd say I'm experiencing the divine about, 30 or 40% of the time. And sometimes I forget that I can. Mm-hmm. And just this frame, it's, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like it causes my own soul to use more of my soul level peripheral vision. And it's like, oh yeah, that, right. Oh. And I wasn't living there. And
Right.
the conditioned self is like, well, I'm talking and I have to be here, and
Uh-huh.
sort of put the non-peripheral, the peripheral blinders on, and I can't be connected to that at the same time. And it's like, is that really true? Because
Hmm.
there it is. It's never not there. My Aikido teacher once told this story about something his teacher said to him, and he said he was training and he was really good, and but he was having a bad night, and he said to his teacher, "Yeah, I'm just kind of out of it tonight." And his teacher said to him, "Yes, but it is still there."
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
love that. It's like, oh, right, because it's so easy to think, oh, I'm out of it. It's not available. I can't do it. And it's like, no, no, no. It's always you. It's always you. It's always you.
Yes, always.
It doesn't forsake us like the Bible teaches, the New Testament teaches us.
And I love that you brought, yes, I love how you brought the peripheral vision, because third eye access
Mm.
will, those who have that are born with it. They may have a sense of some aspects of divinity, but only incomplete versions of it. And it's the same principle here. They're bypassing the mind when you use third eye, right? Um, but unless even a third eye person undergoes an emotively based deconditioning and reconditioning path, the direct experience of a limitless kind of holoarchal divine being is largely locked out of us. A third eye person can only stay in the peripheral zone, not the centered embodied zone about
Mm-hmm.
it. Do their personal healing. So this is really an important point. Feel it. If I'll connect the two dots here, then if we are inside of divine being at the same time, it lives inside of us. If you can just, if people who are listening here can just feel what are the repercussions of that, and you can actually feel connect the dots that I'm inside of the same thing that is inside of me. That is so present, it's insane, and that presence is so big, it makes it absent to the dualistic mind. So,
Let me speak to something I'm experiencing right now that maybe is a subset of one of the earlier items on your list, but I think it bears explication. And
go
that
ahead.
is the reason we don't experience the divine is because for our protection mechanisms, it's threatening, disorienting, chaotic, frightening, and it doesn't necessarily experience it as good.
No, that's
And
right.
that's what when we're looking for something that's going to
Yes.
feel good.
Yeah, and the meta principle behind that is the protection is always has to be in control.
Yes, control.
Right? And so it's something that you're inside of that is not controllable, or that you're inside of it and it's not controllable. This is terrifying.
Yeah.
So emotional wounding, which always involves a protective contraction in our soul field, is always going to be based in control and predictability and safety and security.
Yeah.
And it is not interested in the chaos of the actual verb flow of consciousness.
Yeah. But if it's a white guy with a beard, then that's way very knowable, not chaotic, and he has a
Right,
plan
right.
and he's all knowing. And we've had a previous podcast about God is not omniscient, which would be a very lovely, comforting idea. And I remember talking
Yeah,
about that and experiencing a kind of terror, like, oh shit, it's not omniscient.
yeah,
Because that
yeah,
also chaosifies it, and that's part of the
yeah.
experience.
It's so important because then you terrifyingly, in a lot of us, means that we're responsible for our experience to another whole degree. If God is not omniscient, well, what the fuck? Neither is my protection omniscient then.
Yes.
And so nothing is safe then. If God isn't omniscient, then we're way down the line of that. We're in trouble, right?
Hmm.
So in that sense, uh, uh,
And there's another good reason. There's a great little fractal example. Fractal. Oh, that's interesting.
practical.
Fractal, like a popsicle.
Good one,
It's
yeah.
the popsicle that is part of all popsicles. It's
Yeah.
fraxicle. Um, that processing the lack of safety in childhood emotionally is a really key piece for accessing the experience of the divine, because if you feel existentially and emotionally unsafe still
Yes.
at the level of personhood,
Yes.
it makes you unable to bear the chaosification or the impermanence in sainthood and sagehood both, because it's
Exactly.
very threatening to stability and control.
And yet now we can make a closure back to your first comments here. That is why in the earlier years, solely worked on personhood with people and didn't go deeply into sage. Because of exactly what you just said, you're not going to be ready for the challenges in sage or saint until you get a more emotively mature seat of being. So this becomes problematic, of course, when sometimes before a person's done sufficient amount of emotive maturity work, the non-dual finds people, like we talked about, the woman in the podcast before last. It just finds you. You can't control that, and you've got to just live with that and assume that divine being doesn't unfold itself in certain ways that is greater than our ability to deal with. So, in that sense, that personhood piece, and we connect another dot that you said also, that EBE is a spiritual practice. It's not a psychotherapy.
Right.
It's a spiritual practice that takes advantage of the insights psychology uncovered in the last 140 years, but is based on an entire different foundation of emotivity first, unlike Freud and Jung and Adler and all the rest of them.
Well, it does. Okay. Yeah, and it answers that question that Freud asked in 1915. How do you make the unconscious conscious? So
right.
It just sees the unconscious as an aspect of soul, and he was not looking at it that way because he was in science land.
That's exactly right. Jung was a little softer about that because he was interested in Eastern teachings.
Yeah.
So that's why Jung, for me, is far more of a role model than Freud, who, they both had interesting personality defects that were pretty demonstrable.
I'm sure it was very hard for them to find a good therapist, being probably the best therapists around at the time. It's like, that's why you should, if there's only that old joke about if there's two barbers in town, you should go to the one with the worst hair, go to the one with the worst haircut. Yeah, because the other guy's cutting his hair.
Yeah. Cutting his hair, right, exactly. Okay, that's 11. We'll reboot each one of these at the end here.
Okay.
Now, the next island that connects to this, what's the word for a string of islands? It's called
archipelago.
Yes, archipelago. Mm-hmm. It's archipelago of 13 assumptions. Nice. The next island is, since 2012, and here's another reason why we don't experience divine being. Since 2012, the yin aspect of divine being has replaced the yang aspect. So the big, hairy thunderer in the sky, or his son, the blue-eyed and white-skinned Jesus, whatever you want to believe about that, that's fine. They're now obsolete. All projections of divine being now since 2012 as a yang-based entity are obsolete. And as such, require us to learn an entirely different way of relating to divinity through yin-based stillness and surrender algorithms, as opposed to the mind and will-based and energy-based manifestations of yang. Mm-hmm. So another reason why we don't experience in the modern day a divine being anymore is if you're holding on to a hairy thunderer in the sky of a patriarchal God who's jealous and punitive, you are not going to, there's another thing that's going to keep you from experiencing the yin divinity that now rules the consciousness roost of the human condition. So there's another pearl in the archipelago, however you pronounce that. Archipelago. That will prevent us from experiencing divine being if we're holding on to old patriarchal versions of it, as all religions do by our conditioning. Yeah. Right? Okay, so now we get to number 13 here, the final island in our chain. To ever discover the big E holon essence, the holoarchal divinity, in this case, yin divinity, we have to first learn to embody our own small e holon soul essence first.
Mm-hmm.
Because our small e holonic nature is emoto soulful. In other words, another reason you don't experience a divine being is you are not in touch with the first version of it, which is your own soulfulness. So unless you do personhood, as you said earlier, in Edenity, you will not discover or ensoul your consciousness with that which is previous to your personality affectations, right? So you'll never get the divine being if you're not in touch first with your own bloody soul, your own individuated soul that has a mental body and a will body and an etheric body in between lifetimes.
And that's a good place to insert a distinction because you can have spiritual experiences here and there without being more essential in embodiment. But you can't abide ongoingly with the divine without connection to that soul. And that's where a lot of people get hooked. And I for sure was hooked on that for a while. The repeated spiritual experiences as a way to have an abiding relationship with the divine. It's very tempting, but it doesn't work.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up. Those kinds of experiences of the divine are episodic, right? And like a drug, in the most negative way of framing it, you've got to keep having the drug because it's not actually medicinal. It doesn't actually change something. It gives more insight, more expansion, blah, blah, blah. But in that sense, to actually abide full-time seamlessly with the structural seamlessness of our small h holon with a capital WH holon, you've got to outwork, you've got to have already encountered your own piece of the WH holon, which is your soul.
Well, it just heartens me there for a moment because entheogens, hallucinogens, whatever you want to call them, are at an all-time high popularity, pardon the pun, the highness there. So that's producing a lot more spiritual experiences than used to be for probably plenty of atheists and agnostics. And like for me in my early 20s, my use of LSD was instrumental in finding a spiritual path. I would not have been interested in it whatsoever if I didn't have those spiritual experiences. And so I think more and more people are going to be, after having those episodic encounters, are going to be hungry for wanting to abide with it. And because they're going to dead end just the tastes here and there.
Exactly. And that's why this development is not a devolutional step. It's an evolutional step because it will give people the barest of experiences of the divine, albeit mediated by chemistry or by plants,
spirits,
and spirits. So it's a great way to do that as long as you don't get too hooked on it. And there's a dead end to that too, but everyone's got to have their own path with it. So Edenity would say if you've never had an experience of something bigger than your own ego focus, try some of these under good supervision and as sacred rituals and not as just recreational stuff. And see it for what it is. It can open doorways for further inquiry. But in the end, you've got to come back home, clear your brain of those and your physical body of those effects of that, because there are. But and then get busy on your what you're resisting in feeling how unsafe the world feels to you.
Because a spiritual experience can be just an improvement upon a belief. And it's just, I'm going to have, every couple of months a spiritual experience, and then I feel porosified and lit up, and then next quarter I need to do it again.
Exactly.
Which is where a lot of people live.
Yeah. And again, that's where they are at this point in time. And the basic parameter here is Edenity. Any experience of that which is beyond your own dualistic focus is helpful to one day turn into a permanent abidement. So in that sense, discovering our own piece of the spiritual pie, which is our personal soulfulness first, is impossible to do from the mind eye, humanism. It's impossible to do from the negation of our mind eye, Buddhism. It's also impossible to do from the collectivization of our mind eye, which is Hinduism, or an apology for having selfish urges of the mind or will, which is all Western religionism. None of those, humanism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Western religionism, none of them are going to deliver you to your soul. And as much as there are really good aspects to all of those things, they're not going to deliver you to your soul until you realize that the path to embodying your own soulfulness upstream of your local personality is automatically attained by uncoiling all the rocks that sit on top of that natural geyser of being. We always said in the early days too, in 1.0, that EBE on the way to ensoulment, as we would say now, is a subtractive, not an additive process. You subtract wound contractions that kink the tube of your geyser of soul to come forward from behind to your in the soul domain to the human domain. So in that sense, the only way to encounter to be ensouled in your own piece of the spiritual pie before you could ever get access to the holon, WH holon. You won't be delivered there by humanism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or Western religions. They just don't go that deep. So there's 13. Let me just summarize here before we go back, if there's any more questions about each of them. These 13 proposals are an inevitable unfolding that explains why, one layer at a time and with a couple of sidebars, explains why we don't experience ourselves firstly as souls and secondly as children of the divine, as an abiding permanent state. Because if we're not experiencing it as an abiding personal state, then somewhere we have a terror of being, a terror of not being, or a terror of non-being obstructing that permanent access. So in that sense, this explains that inevitable unfolding of those 13 islands in the, I still can't remember. Archipelago. It explains why so few of us in history have ever had the experience of divine being. Consciousness modes that are conditioned by ancient and modern paradigms, secular and spiritual paradigms, prevent it. And here's where you already anticipated a while ago. Because human consciousness is primarily emotive, and we are small h holons of a love-based holon, then we're intrinsically made of love also in this no separation, seamless relatedness with divine being. And love, the best way we can describe it in the most meta sense is that it's an emotive reality. So unless you are really, in that way, human consciousness, because it's a child of a love-based divine being, human consciousness is made of emotiveness, way upstream of willfulness or mentalness or physicalness. And that's the key that Edenity, the brand new sea change that it gives to all forms of spiritual evolution and personal evolution tied in one paradigm without any separation, just like we are tied without any separation from divine being.
Yeah, recently I've been talking with people about a way of describing how our protection mechanisms work and how they act as like traffic cops with emotion. They want to feel the good feelings and repress the bad feelings. And there's an expression of dualism, which was one of the items on the list. And the divine just doesn't relate to reality that way. It's not like but isn't it funny how we think, or people think, that there's more God in a church or a temple than, as you used to say, on a gutter in Calcutta. Like, if it's everywhere, then it can't be more in some place than another. And the way we holonically can embody that is that there's as much God in joy as there is in depression in one way.
Exactly. That's right.
But if we're not relating to it in that unilistic, inclusive way, then we separate ourselves out from the wholeness with a capital W of the divine.
Yeah, I love that point you made, because there are points on the planet that are chakral points for the planet that they call sacred spaces or sacred sites or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The Earth breathes its own chakral system, and those undeniably exist. But that doesn't mean that they're any more sacred than a square foot in the worst part of New York City or Calcutta. The orientation here is that everything is divine, and if you strategize, oh, I'm going to create a sacred space in my home that has candles and an altar, and I'm going to dress more in robes and have canopies and not right angles in my home, and all these kinds of things. That's good.
Yeah.
That's where you're at. That's fine, but that's spiritual dress up.
Yeah.
When you really emotively mature spiritually through emotivity, nothing is strategic. You don't need any sacred spaces because you're too busy being sacred yourself. You don't need any accoutrements that way. So all this means that Yin Divinity is now awaiting humanity. It's awaiting humanity to wake up from the partially true, partially not true stories of Eastern and Western religious antiquity and of modern scientific empiricism. It's waiting for us to wake up to a completely, oh my God, a self-verifiable experience.
Mm-hmm.
Mediated by learning more and more deeply to embody every day we feel, therefore we are, orientation to human consciousness. So Edenity offers, in all these ways, invites anyone with the necessary fortitude, openness, or curiosity about a consciousness adventure to test.
A consciousness adventure. Nice. That sounds like the subtitle of a book.
There you go. Edenity is a consciousness adventure, and we're urging you to test it, hike the terrain, the inner terrain that Edenity invites you access to that other paradigms, I'm sorry to say, just don't. They just don't at the moment. And test it for both its metaphysical sobriety and its real results.
When I talk to people about very often it's about the belief in God that they have or disbelief, and if I tell them there's a way to actually have an abiding relationship with it, mm-hmm. I don't know if I've ever spoken to someone who was like, really? Tell me more about that. Yeah. And I don't understand why not. I can understand why someone wouldn't want to dig up all the wounds from their childhood to become, a mystery, more authentic self. Who would I be then? You don't know. I can understand that. But if that would lead to a direct abiding experience with the divine, how could you not want to try that out? I don't understand. I've never understood that. That sounds just like the coolest thing in the world, but I guess that communicates more something about me than it does other people.
It does, Joseph. And that's why you and I inevitably met this lifetime. Mm-hmm. Even though we engineered it ahead of time, it's still always miraculous to me. Mm-hmm. Another way to posit all this is in a really easily summarizable way is that we no longer need churches and temples and pagodas and shuls and we're walking, each one of us is a church, each one of us is a temple, because we're a downline expression of the divine, and the whole structure is already waiting for us, and Edenity unlocks the key to experience that structural reality. I was talking with Casey, one of our colleagues, mm-hmm. and he had this beautiful metaphor. I'd like to end it with that. Case, if you're hearing this, man, I love this metaphor. He said it once. He was led to make a drawing, and there's 3 elements to it. There's a sun, and it's shining on a lock, a lock. Uh-huh. And as the sun shines on the lock, the shadow has the shape of the key.
Oh, cool. Uh-huh.
that what appears to be the lock, how do I align my human frailties and imperfections with the divine? The answer, the key is in the lock. It's in the humanity itself.
Mm-hmm.
By unrolling that emotively in the way that Edenity has found a way to crack the code, the key to an abiding relationship with divinity is in the lock, not by transcending the lock.
By turning toward the shadow, that which we most want to turn away from.
Exactly right.
And find the essentialness in it that was long and lost.
Oh, yes and yes. So that's today's. 13 steps, interestingly, 13 islands in an archipelago. I did it, of unfolding islands that lead us from being trapped in having no experience of God at the one end and having a 100% one day embodiment of it as a constant relational companion for your life. And how could you not want it as a full-time companion for your life?
That's what I want to speak to. Yeah, I want to say a little bit more, because just in recent days, as work in my own process has been coming to a kind of a momentary fruition, where we often say that EBE is 90% work. What do we call it? 90% setup. 90% setup and 10% payoff. Well, in the last week, I'm starting to experience some of that payoff.
Just in time, not in content.
Yeah. There's cycles of it. And so I've been reaping some of the rewards of work that goes back like a year. And I've just been feeling this astonishment, just an astonishment that more people don't want to do this. I don't understand. Like, is the pursuit of happiness that is so visibly not working for people?
Yeah.
It's so visibly not working. Is the consumerism, is the collectivism, is the distractionism, is social media, is all of these things, the religion, it's so obviously bereft of beauty, bounty, meaning, fulfillment. Is it really working for people so well? I'm just astonished. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I can go into my head and be like, okay, well, younger souls and people have to dead end, and there's just a, I don't know, there's something in me I'm not yet fully processed. It's a sorrow of like,
that's it.
It's right here. It's right freaking here. There's a whole new set of questions, a map that can be followed, mysteries that have been solved for you.
Yes, ahead of time.
So you can find your own new mysteries, but you don't have to go in circles. And I just something in me is just astonished that it's not more popular. Well,
you named it already. Let me just highlight it. When people ask me what's Edenity's, how would it name the deepest addiction of humanity? And happiness. I would say it's happiness. Yeah. So while that becomes the North Star of all of our efforts, we are doomed to be stuck, because happiness is transient outside. Happiness is always related to circumstances on the outside that you enjoy, whereas real joy is impossible unless you go inward and take the hero's journey to the underworld, as we said in other podcasts. So in this case, the underworld is our inner world of unconscious wounding. So I love you. How you wish. How can the world not?
But the pursuit of happiness has to dead end many lifetimes over before you give up on it.
That's right. Stay with it. If that's your track, just know that one day, one life, there's another choice to be made between secular humanistic atheism and religious Eastern or Western spirituality. There's something in between that links the two and obviates the singular abidement in either. So a true, not a union of East and West, but
Not a synthesis, but a metathesis. What did you call it?
I call it a metathesis.
Metathesis, yeah.
Not a synthesis. The integral theory is a synthesis of East and West. But Edenity is a metathesis of it. You need to have a metathesis to two conflicting theses, a metathesis, right? So that's what Edenity is. And until next time, consider that what a boon it would be to have divine being as a lively companion. You said about 30%. That's more than I was at your age. That's for sure.
Really? No.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because you lost it for a while. Yeah.
I had to lose it. I can honestly say with no hubris at all that upwards of 80% to 85% of my day is consciously in abidement with divine being. And to me, that is already attainment because remember, Joseph, in the early days, let's just reverse the protective 2/3 and authentic. So 2/3 authentic. Well, the same applies in the big spiritual realms too. If I can have 2/3 of my consciousness baking in divine being consciously in the day, I've made it.
Yeah, well, I can feel, because sometimes it's, that's on average. Sometimes it's 5%. Other days on some days it's more than 50.
Yeah,
and then shit gets stirred up. When I feel it and I start to feel the chaos and like, how am I going to plan my life? And I don't have control over my outcomes anymore. So I can feel that sometime down the line, there's a kind of reckoning that's going to be Joseph having to let go of his life in some ways that I'm still negotiating. Some part of me is still negotiating with. I can feel that coming.
Well, yeah, I love that you brought the percentages in because that's how we hold it. There's some moments in a day where I'm 100%, and other times I'm 60 or 55 or 70, and the average is around 80. So it's never a constant flow because divine being is
not
always
a state. It's not a noun. Yeah. But yeah, I sometimes dip into that over 50 thing or whatever, where there's more of it than me, and that brings up the terror of non-being, which I've started to actually chip away at.
Yes.
And it's a lot working 3 hoods at the same time. But what the fuck else is there to do? You can pursue happiness instead, and get in search of the perfect Pinot Noir or Cappuccino and find really great restaurants and stuff. But like, ugh.
Or wait for it.
Or both.
No. Another domain. Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are going to get together in a match to see who can beat up the other one in a cage match. I'm not making this up.
They're talking about that?
They're talking about they dislike each other, whether that dislike is a media construct or not. They're going to do a cage match of some kind to see who can beat up the other one.
Come on.
These are 2 billionaires who apparently have attained some sort of happiness, and yet this is the kind of thing that they're drawn to do. So what world is this? What world is this, Joseph?
I see this. I had to Google this right now because as the producer of this show, I feel responsible for occasional fact checking. Matt Brown reacts to the news that Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter owner Elon Musk are reportedly serious about fighting each other. Yes, one day ago, this is actually happening.
Yes.
Because who has more money can't settle the issue. They've got to actually come to fisticuffs to determine who is, insert the adjective, more right. What? I don't know what.
And you know what breaks my heart in one way is these are 2 autistic.
I was just going to say, who's more autistic? They should fight over that.
Yeah, they're both on the spectrum, and this is a compliment. People on the spectrum tend to be geniuses in certain domains, exclusive of other domains.
They should fight over who blew more billions in the last 2 years. Elon taking over Twitter and trying to be its CEO and firing people horribly, or Zuckerberg pursuing, as a projection of his own wounding, pursuing virtual reality in completely stupid and poorly implemented ways.
Oh my God, those that when they renamed it Meta,
No.
the irony was so thick. I was defecating it. The irony, it was so
Right.
astounding.
Technology, meta via technology. Yeah, sure. That's exactly how the mind thinks. Well, if I just think about this small enough, I'll somehow arrive at some big picture perspective. Yeah, good luck with that. Have to create a whole new reality, and then somehow I'll find the real reality by creating a new reality.
Or on the other end of the spectrum, exactly the same thing that astrophysicists do by plumbing the secrets of the origin of the universe by going smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yes, right.
Oh,
and that's on the list, the dualistic mind. Let's make smaller pieces and we'll find God because it's the needle in the haystack somewhere, right?
Yeah,
rather than the haystack.
For them, God is the Big Bang, That's our creator. So, okay.
So I can't wait to read this article. Yeah, I mean, if they sold tickets, sure, why not? Wow, I'd watch that.
I'd have to. Yeah, it's like watching. I can't watch golf, but I can golf once every 10 years, but only ironically. I can bowl once every 30 years, but only ironically. But this stuff, people dedicate their whole lives to it. It's called also reality TV.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay.
Well, my mind is blown that that's actually real.
Can I talk about next time?
Yeah, next time, if logistics work out. At the moment, it's planned, but due to the chaosification of life, you never know. But at the moment, we're going to have a special guest and going to be talking about, similar to what we talked about with Laura, is going to be a personhood, sagehood possible blend. And we're going to see if we can help a dear friend of Edenity and someone who is dealing with a stuck place with some identical perspectives.
Identical, sure. Yeah. Well, in other words, it's going to be sort of like a real time how Identity addresses someone who's really in a difficult spot. Not just we reported on it with Laura, but as I understand it, Joseph,
he's going to show up. He's going to be right here next to me. Yeah, he's going to be in my little studio. So that's what will be. That'll be episode 62.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. It just hit me on episode 100. We're going to drink. Let's drink through the episode.
All right, but for that, please, I have a white wine from France that costs about $200 a bottle, and I ache for it. I tasted it once in a restaurant and I swooned literally. So we're on our 100th one. Let's get together and maybe cost share here and get a bottle of that at either end. And
maybe a bottle each.
A bottle each. Yes, that's what I meant.
Sure.
And we'll toast with a very expensive French white, which are just so exquisite. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Stace.
Right. Thank you, sir. Lovely as usual.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. And until next time, as I always say, we wish you well on your journey. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.